and welcome to this week's edition of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. I'm your host, Josh Hennig. Coming up today on the podcast, a couple topics we want to touch on, specifically the aftermath of the McGregor-Khabib fight. I'm going to give you some pretty uncensored, politically incorrect analysis of what really is going on with the UFC and the Khabib McGregor situation. Also, I'm going to give you my review of the Venom movie from Sony Pictures, the Marvel anti-hero debut on the big screen in his own movie. So let's get started on this week's edition of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. Topic number one on this week's edition of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. So I was out at a local establishment here in South Jersey to watch UFC 229. The headliner of the event was UFC lightweight champion Khabib Nurmagomedov defending his belt against Conor McGregor. And there was a lot of storylines that went into the fight. There's a lot of hype going into the fight. And all in all, it was actually an interesting fight. I know some people out there thought it might have been a boring fight, but people think it was a boring fight. They don't fully understand the fight game at all. And styles make fights. Khabib is a grappler. He's been a submission-type wrestling mixed martial artist for his entire life. Conor McGregor is a stand-up striker. He's a leaner fighter. He's not as strong and thick as Khabib is. McGregor's game has always been dependent on his footwork, his speed, and his ability to connect fist to face. Khabib's experience, on the other hand, has been dependent on, he believes that because of his work ethic and his training, that his skill set and his endurance and his strength and durability is what's going to win him many fights. So you get two very different fighters going head-to-head stylistically. And you also had two fighters going against each other who are very different in a multitude of ways. I'm going to give you a perspective on this fight you're not going to get anywhere else. And I know for some people, this is probably going to be some politically incorrect. I know for some people, this is going to be maybe even offensive. But someone has to explain the bad blood between McGregor and Nurmagomedov in a way that I don't think most people grasp. This goes far beyond the incident in New York. The incident where McGregor took the dolly, threw it at the bus, broke a window, injured a couple people, and pretty much changed the futures and the lives of numerous people. That weekend was also the weekend that Khabib Nurmagomedov won the UFC lightweight championship in a way that, for all intents and purposes, was bull. Khabib has a championship because of injuries. Tony Ferguson got injured right before the fights. They tried to get a replacement, Max Holloway. Max wasn't able to cut the weight in time. They basically grabbed Al Iaquinta last second to jump in for this fight. And Al's a good guy. He's a tough fighter, but he didn't have the prep time or the skill set to really deal with what Khabib was bringing to the table. So Khabib won the title. And now Khabib has beaten another fighter in his first title defense who has not fought in 2 years. Conor McGregor may be one of the biggest names in mixed martial arts, but he was still a fighter who had not stepped inside a UFC octagon in about 2 years. Because he fought Floyd Mayweather, he was dealing with some personal issues outside of the octagon, stuff that, whether you believe rumors or not, may have had to do with his family, may have had to do with some things that he may or may have not said. Dana White has confirmed that McGregor was not ready to come back to mixed martial arts because of personal reasons. And we'll leave it at that. I'm not going to get into conjecture of information that is not my information to confirm or corroborate. But what I can confirm is that McGregor looks at Khabib and thinks he's fraudulent. And he kind of is. Just look at who Khabib has fought in chronological order from Conor McGregor moving backwards. Before him, he beat Al Iaquinta, who was not even a top 5 ranked fighter when Khabib was given the belt in that fight. Khabib before that beat Edson Barbosa, an elite striker who has little to no takedown defense, a guy who just does not have the grappling ability or the strength to deal with what Khabib brings to the octagon. Before that, he fought Michael Johnson. Michael Johnson is a fighter who actually should be fighting at 145, but he prefers to stay at 155. So he's a very undersized 155er compared to Khabib's size. Before that, he fought Darrell Horcher in a catchweight bout at 160 pounds because Khabib has had a history of not being able to cut weight in the past. Khabib had another catchweight bout where he missed weight versus Abel Troyo back at UFC 160. And in between there, he fought Pat Healy and Rafael Dos Anjos. Now, Dos Anjos is a former lightweight champion, so he's not a pushover. He also fought Thiago Tavares and Gleison Tibau. But if you notice, each one of the fighters I mentioned, McGregor coming off a 2-year hiatus, Al Iaquinta, no prep time, except in last minute to take on the fight. Edson Barbosa, one-dimensional fighter. Michael Johnson, undersized fighter. Darrell Horcher, lesser skilled fighter than Khabib is. Pat Healy, not on the same skill level. Tavares, Tibau, guys who are not on the same skill level as Khabib either. Khabib has not fought the best fighters in the UFC. And for a group of fighters, they feel that as a problem. And they think that Khabib has gone out of his way to get out of fighting certain elite fighters who could break his undefeated streak. And there was even a rumor that after this fight, Khabib was going to retire undefeated. Well, now he can't. He can't because Nevada is holding his $2 million plus paycheck from the UFC until he comes to this hearing. Nevada Athletic Commissioner Executive Director Bob Bennett has announced that both McGregor and Khabib Nurmagomedov will be temporarily suspended pending a hearing that will take place October 24th. So on October 24th, the Nevada Athletic Commission will hold a vote on whether McGregor and Nurmagomedov will be indefinitely suspended pending the results of their investigations. Now, there were previous reports that they would have this hearing in mid to late November, but it seems as though they have found a way to accelerate the process and get a decision sooner than later. And part of it has to do with the fact that they are holding Khabib Nurmagomedov's check. A part of it also has to do with the fact that, in all practical purposes, everybody wants a resolution to what the UFC and the lightweight division is going to do moving forward with a fighter who is undefeated after not even fighting a top contender until McGregor came back from a 2-year hiatus, versus a fighter in McGregor who is one of the biggest money makers in the sport, and having him out of the game and in limbo for too long hurts not just the UFC, but the entire industry of the fight game. And why are they holding that check? Because of the fiasco. Because Khabib couldn't control his own emotions. Because Khabib, through his mouthpiece, jumped out of the octagon and tried to get into more fights. I understand that Khabib may have been pushed too far. We've all been there. But that's not how you handle it. I don't think Khabib understands how the mixed martial arts world, how the fight game works. I think because of his cultural background, because of his religious beliefs, because of his view of the world, he's not worldly enough to understand that trash talk is part of the game. That it doesn't matter if you believe you're the greatest. There's always going to be someone out there who is going to call you names. There's always going to be someone who's going to trash talk. There's always going to be somebody out there who's going to disrespect you. Khabib does not have thick skin. And because he doesn't have thick skin, he doesn't know how to handle himself. He complained after the press conference, oh, they talked about my religion, they talked about my father. Dude, the whole world is like that. The world is full of people who are going to talk about you, whether behind your back or to your face, or through social media, or through a microphone at a press conference. There's a difference between standing up for yourself and being soft. And Khabib Nurmagomedov, mentally and emotionally, is soft. He has not always taken the most difficult fights. He has always had excuses for his weight cut issues. And now he is arguably the most underqualified UFC lightweight champion to ever fight. Even a guy like Frankie Edgar, he fought BJ Penn twice and beat him. He fought Gray Maynard. He fought all kinds of guys when he was champion. The majority of guys who have been the UFC champion at multiple weight classes, their resume isn't a last-minute fight with a guy who's not even top 5. And then your next fight is basically a payday fight against the biggest money name in the fight game. Khabib may think that he earned his title shot. Khabib may think that he is great. Khabib may think that he's the best fighter in the world. But there's tons of people who don't. And just because people disagree with you and they do it in a very disrespectful and vitriolic way doesn't give you the right to act out like a child, like a punk, like a brat. Just because McGregor was wrong and did bad things and said wrong things and has been disrespectful doesn't give you the right to act the same way. Which gets into the other issue behind all of this. Khabib Nurmagomedov is a practicing Muslim. Conor McGregor is a traditional Irish Catholic. And I know a lot of you out there are not educated about the history of religions, but the Catholics and the Muslims have a deep, long history of hating each other. It goes back to the 600 and 700 AD. You're talking about a history of wars, of murders, of assassinations, of conquests, of kidnappings, of raiding, of pillaging. A cultural history that goes back 15 to 1600 years. A cultural hate between religious groups. When McGregor and his people called Khabib names, it wasn't just because who Khabib is. It's because of what his religion is. It's because of what his culture is. Khabib being from Dagestan. Dagestan is near the coast of Georgia and is basically hundreds of miles away from Armenia. You're talking about an individual who's from a part of the world that is nothing like the rest of Russian culture. You could actually argue that the people who live in that part of Russia are not even part of the rest of the country. Moscow and St. Petersburg and Siberia, the things that we typically identify with Russia, those are areas of the country that are thousands and thousands of miles away from Dagestan. Khabib didn't grow up in a world like Conor McGregor. Just like Conor didn't grow up in a world like Khabib. The thing is that you have two people whose religious and cultural backgrounds are extremely different. Conor grew up in the ghetto outside of Dublin, basically. Conor came from nothing, tried to make himself into something, and the part of the reason why Conor has this braggadocious and brash attitude is because he says, I made myself into something, and I have every right to act however I think I want to act, because I'm great. And I'm going to tell everybody how great I am, because I'm a self-made man. Khabib doesn't come from a world where people do stuff like that. Khabib comes from this world of where we respect other martial artists, and I show you respect, you show me respect. You know, I come in, I grind, I want to fight fighters who are going to make me better, they're going to improve my lot in life. Conor wants to go fight the biggest, baddest dude on the planet. That's all he cares about. Conor doesn't care if it's Khabib, if it's Floyd Mayweather, if it's Eddie Alvarez. He'll fight GSP. He'll fight anybody. He doesn't care. You know, Khabib doesn't think about it like that because Khabib comes from a different world. And between the history of religious hatred between the Muslims and the Catholics, the totally different cultures that McGregor and Khabib come from, one being he basically grew up near the Middle East practically, and Conor, who grew up as basically a ghetto rat in Ireland. One guy grew up wrestling and grappling and and getting years and years of instruction and training. The other guy was basically fighting to stay alive and one day decided to take up martial arts and boxing to protect himself, to not get killed. Conor has a kill or be killed attitude. Khabib doesn't have that. Khabib doesn't understand and doesn't relate to the Western cultures of the world because of where he's from. That's why all of this escalated the way it did. And I said this months ago. I believe Conor McGregor's mind was altered when he attacked that bus back in April. I don't know if he was on cocaine. I don't know if he was on some other mind-altering substance of that type of extreme. But he was on something. Because you look at the look in his eyes when he was doing that compared to how he looked the next day when he was arrested, it was like two different human beings. I know for a fact Conor McGregor has two different people. There's notorious Conor McGregor, who you see in the media, in the octagon, at press conferences, in public. And then there's the McGregor, when all the cameras are off, he is not that kind of person. He puts on an act and a show to help sell fights, to help gain attention, to put himself in a position where he can keep marketing himself. Khabib has no interest in playing a hero or a villain role. He has no interest in promoting himself or any of that kind of stuff. Khabib just thinks that he's going to go out there and compete and be this great fighter. He does not understand how to function in a world that is different than the culture that he grew up in. So now one guy is thin-skinned and can't control himself because he doesn't know how to relate to other people. And the other guy is too brash and disrespectful for his own good. Now both of them have to face the Nevada Athletic Commission, and they both put the UFC in a ridiculous predicament. Now that Khabib has won, defended his belt, who's he going to fight? He was supposed to fight Tony Ferguson 4 times, and 3 of the 4 times didn't happen. It was Khabib's fault. Whether it was injury, whether it was a supposed issue with his weight cut, 3 of the 4 times Khabib had an excuse or a reason, depending on whose side you're on, because everyone's taking sides on this for some dumb reason. He always had a reason why he couldn't fight, conveniently. The one fighter who is a volatile matchup for him. Because Tony Ferguson is the perfect matchup to foil Khabib. Ferguson is physical. Ferguson has length. Ferguson has the size, the strength, the athleticism to counter what Khabib is bringing in to the octagon. Half of the fighters that Khabib has fought are smaller than him. Or they don't have the grappling experience. Or they don't have the extensive endurance that Khabib has. He's always fought fighters who are lesser than him in something. He's never fought fighters who are equal to or better than him at anything. And partially that's his own fault. So now the number one contender is Tony Ferguson after his victory over Anthony Pettis at UFC 229. Khabib is the champion. So are we going to try to reschedule this for the 5th time? Are you going to do a rematch with Conor McGregor? Or does Conor McGregor want to have a 3rd fight with Nate Diaz? I was told by a source that when Nate Diaz and Conor McGregor signed their current contracts, that they signed those contracts with the understanding that they were going to get a 3rd fight. So could that fight be what's next for McGregor instead of fighting Khabib? And then if Nate Diaz, let's say he beat Conor McGregor, does he fight Khabib next? Anthony Pettis, where does he fall into all this? He just lost to Ferguson, who is now considered the number 1 contender. And on top of all this, then you have the Nevada hearing. And Nevada basically has a few different options. They can just fine Khabib extremely. They're already holding his $2 million check. So maybe they fine him for $1 million of that $2 million. They could also suspend him 6 months, a year, 2 years, whatever it is, for his actions. And a suspension might not be the worst thing because, look, if you suspend him for 6 months from fighting, he can still defend the belt in 2019. It's not like you're eliminating him from the entire equation for an entire year or 2 or 3 like has happened to John Jones. John Jones has been taken out of the game totally because of his actions. And John Jones is a topic for a whole nother day. So they could suspend Khabib. They could fine him. They could also strip him of his belt. They could deem that he shouldn't have a championship. And they could always void his win over Conor, saying that his actions were the actions of an insane person and try to use some clause that, fighter sanity or something like that, and use that against him. That's always a possibility. And then there's the extreme thing. They could always revoke his license. They could say you're not allowed to fight anymore in Nevada. They could kick him out of the state altogether. And if they do that, then it's going to be hard for him to get a license anywhere else, because most of the states' athletic commissions in this country follow the lead of Nevada, because they consider Nevada the standard for the fight game. So if you're a state like California, if you're a state like Colorado, Texas, Missouri, Illinois, you may follow the lead of Nevada and not feel like you really want to be different or step outside of their punishment, not give this athlete an opportunity to work around the system. So Nevada's got a few different options that they could dish out to Khabib. Now, Conor McGregor is also being called out there. I don't think Conor's going to get suspended. I think Conor could be fined. I think that's more of a likely situation. I don't think he'll be banned. I don't think they'll remove his license. I think he might get fined on some level. Khabib is in a whole world of mess, because whatever the decision Nevada makes is going to affect the UFC. It's going to affect the entire 155-pound division. It's going to affect Khabib's future. It's going to affect everybody. And it's really a frustrating place for the UFC to be in, because heading into 2019, you want all hands on deck because you have this new contract with ESPN. You're going to be moving from the Fox networks to ESPN. So all your fights are going to be on ESPN or on the ESPN Plus digital platform. So you want all of your hands on deck. You want everyone available to put the best fights possible out there for the fans. You can't do that if Khabib has been stripped of his belt, or if he's been banned, or if he's been totally kicked out of the sport. So the UFC right now is hoping that Khabib and his people get this situation straightened out. Because the last thing that you want is no Khabib and no McGregor out there. And if it ever came to that, it's their own fault. Khabib's the guy who threw the mouthpiece and jumped out of the octagon and attacked people. He can talk all he wants about they call my dad names, they call me a terrorist. Get over yourself. I guess Khabib has never seen Twitter, because that's all people do on Twitter. They just attack people. I guess Khabib's never lived in a world where people ever say anything bad about him, because that's what bothers him. Man, you gotta get over yourself. And Conor does not understand one specific element of life. Conor thinks he is unstoppable, that he is untouchable, that nothing bad will ever happen to him, and he can just keep skating through life unfazed, unharmed. One day Conor's going to meet somebody outside the octagon who is going to put him in his place. And I hope and pray for the sake of his wife and his children that that person isn't somebody who is so chemically imbalanced that they leave his wife and his children widowed and fatherless. Because Conor's the kind of guy who tends to say and do the wrong thing more often than not. There's an old saying that all publicity is good publicity. We've all heard that saying. I think in Conor's case it may not be, because he dug himself a lot of holes over the years. He's put himself into a lot of predicaments with his words and his actions. One of these days, those words and those actions are going to put him at a point of no return. And I just hope for the sake of his wife and his children that it doesn't destroy their lives, because Conor can't get a control of his own mouth. Topic number 2 in this week's edition of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. I went and saw the movie Venom, a character that is well known from the Spider-Man universe. Just to give people a little bit of backstory, Back in the late 90s, when Marvel was going through financial issues, they sold off the rights, the movie rights to different Marvel characters. They sold Sony Studios, Spider-Man, and all characters associated with Spider-Man's direct universe. They sold the rights to the Fantastic Four and X-Men to Fox Studios. Now, as we know, Marvel is getting the rights back to the X-Men and the Fantastic Four through the Disney purchase of 21st Century Fox Studios. Marvel has regained the rights to Spider-Man through a co-op agreement with Sony, where Marvel gets to take Spider-Man, they get to direct movies, write the movie, cast the actors, but Sony still retains the distribution rights. So in the end, Sony is the one making the most money off of this deal. But Marvel just wants to have Spider-Man in their universe, because at the end of the day, it's going to make them a ton of money. So when Spider-Man cameos in Captain America Civil War, when Spider-Man appears in Avengers Infinity War, Marvel's still getting all that money. But for these specific Spider-Man movies, Spider-Man Homecoming, or in the next Spider-Man movie, Far Away From Home, Sony's going to make the majority of the movie's money off of those. Well, as a part of Sony keeping the rights to the Spider-Man universe, the long rumored Venom movie finally hit theaters. And this was probably a movie that was about 15 years in the making. When Venom made his first theatrical appearance in Spider-Man 3, which was arguably one of the worst non-Marvel Cinematic Universe Marvel movies ever. Tobey Maguire and his emo goth Spider-Man shtick, and then Topher Grace playing Eddie Brock, which was a really weird Eddie Brock, and then Venom and Sandman and Green Goblin, and them all dealing with Spider-Man. It was just a bad movie. And for years, Sony had toyed around with the idea of reintroducing Venom or giving him his own movie. And in recent years, I think one of the things that became very obvious, and I'm going to review the movie in a second, but one of the things that became very obvious for people who are not a part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe was that in order for you to be successful with a movie that does not have the backing of the MCU behind it in Disney, is you got to have one of two things going for you. You either have to have a character who is so edgy that he's going to be interesting and popular no matter who he's associated with, or you have to have a story and an actor who can portray a character and take it beyond just the surface level of, here's a story about a character who had to save the day. I think that when you look at a character like Wolverine, a character who doesn't even need the X-Men to be popular, or if you look at a character like Wonder Woman, who, even though she's a very major part of the DC comic universe, she's also a character who can stand on her own 2 feet, or Deadpool, a character who has a cult following, who's very edgy, who's a very different character. Those are the kind of characters that have been successful, partly because of who they've cast to be the actors, but also because you allow the characters to breathe. There's never been a time in a movie where Wolverine didn't stab somebody. Not because if Wolverine doesn't stab somebody, it's a travesty, but because that's part of who the character is. He has claws coming out of his hands. What do you think he's going to do with them? Draw on the sidewalk? No, he's going to stab people who are trying to kill him, okay? Wonder Woman. We know the character is a character that's been around for a very long time. So you put her in World War I, it makes sense that that was her first introduction. And you put the movie in World War I with the setting, the culture, the environment, everything that goes along with it. You let the character breathe. And what is Wonder Woman? She's strong, she's powerful, she's intelligent, and in some ways, she's a little innocent and pure. But that's what you want, because you don't want Wonder Woman to be stupid. You don't want Wonder Woman to be too worldly, because that would make no sense, because she comes from a place that has nothing to do with the rest of the world. So there's all kinds of elements that go into these characters. And again, then with Deadpool, as I mentioned, he has a cult following. He's very edgy. He loves to break the fourth wall. They made it R, so that allows you to play around with a lot of the concepts from the comics that maybe you can't do with other movies. Venom follows that trend. The difference with Venom from the other characters I've mentioned is that Venom is a character who, for all intents and purposes, if you don't appreciate science fiction, you're going to find this movie stupid. And what I mean by appreciate science fiction is the history of science fiction storytelling in movies, in books, in comics, in television shows is something that has always been founded on a dismissal of something about reality. You got to suspend belief. You have to let go of certain sensibilities. You got to believe there might be aliens. You have to believe there might be life on other planets. You got to believe you might be able to time travel, that you might be able to alter someone's genetics, that someone could be dead and come back and torment and haunt people. There has to be something about the real world that you have to dismiss. And the story is telling it in a way that it might be real, it might be believable, it theoretically could happen, but it probably won't. I think one of the reasons why people have given Venom so many bad ratings is because they went into this movie expecting it to be like Spider-Man, or they expected it to be this really well-told story, or they expected it to have more depth, or more universal expansion, or something. And Venom was never meant to be any of those things. We have been spoiled by the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Marvel and Disney and their production staff have done such an elite job when it comes to casting, storytelling, filmography, directing, special effects, that everything else is falling short. And even then, these movies are not nominated for Oscars. They're not winning tons of awards at the Academy. Outside of Heath Ledger's Joker, very few of these characters are getting the credit they deserve for their acting from the people in Hollywood. These are action films. These are not great works of cinematic art. We really do need to stop judging these movies based on other great action movies, because at the end of the day, comic books were made not to be great novels of fiction. You want to go read a great novel? Go read something from C.S. Lewis, okay? You're not getting it from a Marvel comic book. You want some great, fantastical novel fiction? There are other people you can go get. You're not getting that from a comic book. So why should you expect that from a movie? Now, let's deal with the movie. Tom Hardy's a boss. I feel like every role Tom Hardy has ever played, he owns it. And he does that again in this movie. He plays Eddie Brock to a T, and he does it in a way that makes sense. It's 2018. If you got possessed by an alien, how would you feel about that? Wouldn't you be freaked out? Wouldn't you be confused? Wouldn't you not know what to do? The same thing happens in the movie. Eddie Brock is a reporter. He gets sucked into this situation. He gets possessed by the symbiote that came on the spaceship. He has to learn how to live with it. And the alien learns how to live with him. And at the end of the movie, spoiler alert, Venom wants to help protect Earth because he realizes that Earth is worth protecting. So he works with Eddie to stop the other symbiote from bringing more symbiotes to Earth, to kill everybody on Earth and take over the planet. They make an agreement at the end of the movie that he tells Venom, look, I get it. You want to eat people, all right? If you're going to eat people, you're only going to eat bad people, okay? And we're not going to just go around killing everybody. And they make their deal, and they cohabitate, basically. It's almost like he's being possessed, but instead of it being by, like, a demon, and, they might have seen, like, The Exorcist or a movie like Constantine or one of those demon possession films, it's an actual creature who he can have a communicative relationship with. It's not a one-way street control going on. And because this involves possession by an alien being, and because this involves a character that is violent, and because this involves a character that's not a real hero, he's an anti-hero in the purest sense of the form. That was a major reason why he was popular in the 80s and 90s in comics. it's not going to be a fun, bright movie. Now, there were funny elements in the movie, but there is definitely a dark edge to the movie. But this is the perfect comic book film. This is what a comic book is. If you picked up a comic book years ago, like I did, that was from the 80s or 90s, this is what you're getting. You're getting a weird story. You're going to suspend some belief. You're going to see some violence. You're going to see some action. You're going to see some fighting. You're going to see some weird stuff. You're going to hear some weird stuff. But it's going to be a fun ride. And that's really what Venom is at the end of the day. I enjoyed it because I thought it was a fun ride. You got to each point of the story in a way that made sense. There wasn't a bunch of plot holes. I wasn't having to sit there and connect the dots or figure anything out. The movie was pretty self-explanatory. You don't have to have read a bunch of comics to know what's going on in this movie. Now, you might have to have read a comic to understand the post-credit scene. The post-credit scene stars Woody Harrelson in a reveal. Eddie Brock has a big interview he has set up. It's his big opportunity to interview this major name, and he goes to prison, they let him in, and he meets Cletus Cassidy. Now, in the comics, Cletus Cassidy is a very famous murderer who escapes jail because he bonds with a symbiote that becomes a character named Carnage. And Carnage becomes the arch nemesis in the comics of Venom. Carnage is more violent and evil than Venom because at its core, Venom is actually very rational. Venom's primal in a lot of his instincts, but he's very rational. He doesn't just kill people for the sake of killing people. He does it because this person attacked me. This is a bad person. I don't like this guy. This guy is trying to hurt people. Or this guy is trying to hurt my host. Carnage, because it's possessing the body of a psychotic serial killer, Carnage is all about chaos. And he wants to cause chaos and murder in the most diabolical way possible. And so there's a whole series of comics where Spider-Man has to fight Carnage, and Venom and Spider-Man work together to defeat Carnage. Bringing him into this movie post-credit scene is very fascinating because at the end of the day, this is a very original film. This is a film that tells the story of Venom without a lot of ties to anything else. There's no Spider-Man ties. It's set in San Francisco. It's on the other side of this country, away from Spider-Man and everybody else in the Marvel Universe. In fact, we really haven't seen San Francisco in any Marvel movie used barely, if at all. It's a very different setting, so you're bringing in a character in Cletus Cassidy who's in prison, a guy Eddie Brock who is Venom, and you're allowing these characters to stand on their own 2 feet away from everybody else. And for me, that's one of the reasons why this works. And again, I appreciate that. I appreciate the fact that they're not trying to go too crazy with it. They're just saying, look, this is self-contained. And maybe one day we'll connect it to Spider-Man and everybody else. Now, the other thing you should know about this movie is that this movie is financially doing very well. Unlike what happened with movies like Justice League, Batman v Superman, Eric Bana's Hulk movie, this movie has already started to work up the records list. Venom had an 80 million plus opening weekend. That defeats Thor, which opened at 15 less million. It outdoes Captain America First Avenger, which opened at 15 less million. It also beat out X-Men Apocalypse, and it beat out The Amazing Spider-Man. So Venom is doing very well. And I think that because he did very well, they're going to have the sequel, which is obviously going to have something to do with Carnage. And I think that it's great that they picked Tom Hardy for this role. He does a great job with the role. And then part of the reason why it's done so well financially compared to those other movies I just named is also because it's very different. People have never seen anything like this before. A movie with a character like Venom is so different than anything we've ever seen. We've never seen an anti-hero like this before. Probably the closest thing you can compare Venom to, for anyone who's watched the movies like Riddick, it's kind of got that feel to it, except that Venom is not as smart as Riddick is. Riddick is pretty smart. He's pretty intelligent. He's advanced for someone who is of his ilk, shall I call it. But it does have that little edgy feel to it that Riddick had. If you ever watch movies like Pitch Black or Chronicles of Riddick or the most recent third movie in the series Riddick, it does have that little dark, edge to it because of the violence. It is not R, so it's not as graphic as Deadpool is or as some of the Riddick movies have been. And I know that bothered some people. It didn't bother me. I don't get excited about grotesque violence. It doesn't excite me or get my juices going or any garbage like that. I'm not one of those people who gets excited about excessive violence or thinks it's necessary. I think if there was a little extra blood or something, it probably wouldn't bother me one way or the other because I've seen movies that have that in it. The violent level was probably closer to a Bruce Willis, Die Hard movie than it was like a Deadpool movie or Denzel Washington's Man on Fire or something like that. So overall, I thought the movie was well done. I thought Venom was interesting. It was a fun ride. It definitely stands alone from the rest of the Spider-Man universe, especially since it's set in San Francisco. It's set in a world that does not have a bunch of other superheroes in it. You're not dealing with other characters. It looks like the next character they're going to introduce would be Carnage. I do wish that Sony would consider allowing Venom to interact with other characters, just because I think there would be a level of humor if Venom met any other Marvel character of any significance, just because the Venom character in and of itself is so unique and so different and so bizarre that there would definitely be a comedic element to it. Like there's a point in the movie where Venom attaches himself to Eddie Brock's ex-girlfriend, goes and finds him. The symbiote takes out the people who are going to kill Eddie Brock, and then transfers himself to Eddie. And she later tells him that it was really weird. It felt great having all that power, but it's just really weird. They had this awkward moment because in order for Venom to transfer himself from her to him, there's this like really elongated kiss, and they had this like awkward stare at each other, like what just happened. So, and she later tells them that that was Venom's idea, it wasn't her idea. That makes the situation even maybe a little extra awkward. And then while they're having this conversation later in the movie, Venom, you hear him talking in Eddie's head, like having this like side monologue going on, like his thoughts on the situation and his thoughts on their conversation. So there is some humor mixed in there as well. It's not purely just action and violence and that's it. There is some humor mixed in. So I thought it was fun. I appreciate it. I recommend people go into a lot of these movies with an open mind and not be so hyper judgmental. The next movie I'm looking forward to of the comic book movies, I'm really looking forward to seeing Aquaman. I think that's going to be a fun movie in terms of DC Universe expansion and exploring an aspect that hasn't been put on the big screen. We haven't really seen much of Venom on a big screen, just like we've never seen Atlantis on the big screen. So this is an opportunity for us to be exposed to things we've never seen in movies before, just like we've never had the quantum realm that Marvel introduced in Ant-Man and the Wasp, just like we never had to deal with Thanos and Titan, things of that nature before. I like the fact that we're getting more different concepts introduced to these movies. We're getting more and more characters and universal expansion and digging in the characters and their thinking and their beliefs and their feelings about the world around them. I appreciate that because I think the more you have that, the better it's going to be for the audience to enjoy the movies and their sequels moving forward. Thanks for listening to this week's edition of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. If you enjoyed any of the content, why don't you hit that like button, hit subscribe to catch each episode as we come out with the Mutant Blitz Podcast talking about my thoughts on the world of sports and comic book movies and television shows. Also, if you have any thoughts or opinions on this week's topics, you can drop it in the comments section below. I'm Josh Hennig. Appreciate you tuning in, and I'll catch you next time here on this YouTube channel for the Mutant Blitz Podcast.